This is the Remington New Model Army. Well, sort of. Like the Colt 1860, the original New Model Army would have had an 8-inch barrel on it. This one has a shortened barrel at 4.5 inches, specifically to make it easier to carry. That's a modern thing. Historically, these would have had the 4-inch barrel on smaller calibers, 36 or 31 typically. The New Model Army is one of the sidearms that would have been in service at Gettysburg. Take a look at this one real quick, and then we'll go grab the 1860 and look at some of the differences and why revolvers now look like this instead of like the 1860. So this revolver, you can see full frame, which enables a couple of important features for this particular revolver. Of course, the full frame does make the frame a little bit stronger, and we'll see a little bit on the 1860 why that's important. But this revolver, like the earlier model Colts, of course, the New Model Army was a 1858 design. So like the older Colts, it's just a hinged loading arm rather than a geared one like the 1860 has. But the major thing about this design is you slide this pin out and the cylinder just drops out. And this allows you to hot swap the cylinders and reload significantly faster than the Colts could reload. And reinserting your cylinder was pretty quick and easy too. We just sort of drop the hammer here as we put the cylinder in, and it slides into place, and we can push our pin back in. And if we had a second cylinder, we'd now be reloaded. That also makes these in the modern times significantly easier to convert. But the other thing that we see on these, if we pop this cylinder back out, on the back of the cylinder, you can see there's not only our chambers, which of course have the slot for the bolt, but there's also detents between each of the chambers. Now, what do these detents do? What are they important for? If we pop this cylinder back in here and we go into a carry position, that hammer is now sitting in one of those detents. So you can see there's a chamber here and one here. What that does is that allows us to carry all 6 rounds. Yeah, apparently my watch could hear me. What that allows us to do is carry all 6 rounds without having to worry about having the hammer resting on a percussion cap, which makes this significantly safer to carry. And that's one of the reasons why you have the shorter barrel in the modern times, is because people will carry these under certain circumstances. I will periodically do it, but mostly just to the range. So take a moment, we'll grab the 1860, we'll look at the 1860 and some of the differences on that one. And then I've got something pretty cool to show you guys before we go, and you guys get to see me out in the freezing cold on Cemetery Ridge talking about some of the arms that were used during the battle actually at Gettysburg. All right, so here we've got our Colt Model 1860. This is the same 1860 that we featured multiple times before on the channel. Of course, as we mentioned when we were talking about the Remington, you can see here, this is that geared loading arm. And of course, with the 8-inch barrel, this being an Army version, that loading arm is a little bit longer, makes this one a little bit easier to load. But historically, you would have had that longer loading arm on a New Model Army. The big thing with the Colt versus the Remington, you can see that this is an open top revolver. In order to get this cylinder off of here, you actually have to pull the entire barrel off the front. This one has a screw because it's a reproduction rather than the pin that the Colts historically had, so I'm not going to pop this barrel off of here right now. But that's how you would have to get that cylinder off of here. The other thing that you'll see on here, if we spin this around, there are no detents. Now, there would normally have been some pins on here historically on an actual Colt that the hammer could have rested on. And you can actually see the hammer itself does have the detent for that. You could have rested on one of those pins historically to have carried one of these with all 6. However, those pins were subject to wear, and when they wore down, you'd see what will happen with this one happen in real life, where you sit that hammer on where the pin should be, and it can drop down onto a cap. And of course, we all know why that's problematic. Now, this particular revolver with the brass frame would have been a Confederate model historically. Historically, the Confederates were unable to produce the steel frame revolvers that the Union would use because they didn't have the resources of the Union Army. And that's how you ended up with the brass frames. These brass frames historically did have a problem with warping a little bit, and it would cause the cylinder to begin to misclock. The Remingtons didn't have that problem nearly as much in the brass frame when they did have the brass frame, because they were that full frame, and that's why part of the reason why we see modern revolvers with that full frame. Of course, there are ways in modern times when we're just out here shooting for fun to prevent that misclocking problem. One of the easiest ways to do that is to do what I do with this one and load a lighter charge in it. Historically, what you would have done to prevent that problem, or at least mitigate that problem, is keep track of your shots, and when you ran out, you simply would not turn it around and use the butt of it as a bludgeon. You'd put it away and grab something else. Sort of like the something else that I'm going to go grab now. All right, so before I send you all over to Cemetery Ridge with Past Pilot, this is the something else. Okay. We do a lot of gun stuff. Why do I have this? Well, this thing's actually pretty cool because it's original. This is a Model 1860 U.S. Cavalry Sabre. The way these were marked historically, the historical markings that even this one has, there is no way to trace this to a unit or a soldier or a battle. So this could have just as easily not seen any battle as it could have been at Gettysburg. We don't know. What we do know is that it is marked correctly to be an original, and the wear on it makes sense for it being an original Civil War piece. So this is the something else that you might have grabbed if you were cavalry and you had fired all of your rounds out of your 1860. So, the markings on this, how do we know it's original? How do we know it's US? Besides its patina. Here on the tang, or near the tang, and if this doesn't come through on video, I'll pop up a still that actually shows this. You can see there's a marking that says US. That identifies this as a US saber, a Union saber. The Confederates did not mark their equipment most of the time. So if you saw one of these, and indeed I have seen one of these that was original, that does not have that marking, you would assume typically that it was Confederate, but there would be no way to prove it because it wasn't marked. And here, all the way down on the grip, on the pommel, this JH is an inspector's mark. That inspector's mark is one of the things that we can use to help identify this as an original saber. So, at Gettysburg, where would we have seen this most likely used during the battle? Of course, cavalry was pretty much everywhere on the battlefield. But the cavalry saw the most action on the East Cavalry Battlefield site, which is, if you look at the maps of the Gettysburg National Military Park, which is the full proper name for the Gettysburg Battlefield under the National Park Service, you'll see that that's sort of an exclave of the park over to the east, away from the bulk of the fighting. Yes, there was cavalry on Cemetery Ridge and on Seminary Ridge, but the bulk of the cavalry action, at least that gets talked about in the modern times, was over there on the East Cavalry site. Because I haven't been over there a ton, despite having grown up near Gettysburg, I don't feel I can do that justice. So I'm going to leave that for somebody else to talk about. So now I'm going to send you over to Past Pilot on Cemetery Ridge, and we'll take a look at some artillery that would have been used at Gettysburg. So here we have one of the various different cannons that would have been contemporary to the battle. Each cannon here at Gettysburg is placed in a position where it would have been placed during the battle. This particular example happens to be a rifled cannon. These would have worked in a very similar way to the Kentucky rifle or the muzzle-loading 50 caliber that we featured on the channel before. However, there are some key differences in the way that you would operate a cannon. The loading method for the Kentucky rifle, we don't swab the bore or anything. It's not strictly necessary. Of course, the cannon being horizontal, when the charge goes off, there's liable to be embers and other hot bits left down here that could ignite the next powder charge. So the first order for the gunner's crew would have been to swab the bore to get that all put out, at which point they would have then loaded the powder charge. We're looking at close to a 1 pound powder charge for a gun this size, followed by, because this is a rifled example, some form of a conical shot. Back here at the breech of the gun, we have, this would have been a touch hole in the older models like we would have seen in the Revolution. By the time the Civil War rolls around, we are using a cord that is attached to an igniter that is somewhat reminiscent of the percussion caps that were coming out toward the end of the War of 1812 and into the Civil War, and that's what we would have been using to fire a gun like this. Some of the other guns in the area, not that they're visible in frame right now, were smooth bore, and those would have been capable of firing various different types of canister shot, which would have been very effective against charging armies, which is, of course, something that we would have seen here at Gettysburg on day 3 of the battle with Pickett's charge.